Hi, my name's Keith Cooper, Northlight Images, and in this video I'm going to have a talk about a recent patent that was published by Canon. Now, you may have seen it mentioned on a few of the standard rumour sites, but they've referenced the Japanese patent. The one I'm talking about is the American version of it, and I'll put a link in the notes for this so you can have a look at the actual PDF itself, which has readable text that doesn't need to be translated and looks at. And which the Japanese patents is always tricky because they're quite a formal language is used. The translation doesn't always get the real message across as to what. And remember, patents are a collection of ideas which are being stated as novel to protect them should they be used at some point in a product. A patent is not a product. I always have to give that warning whenever I mention products. Now, it represents a real thing that, some real research that Canon, as some people at Canon have done, and it potentially, aspects of it could appear in a patent. Now, this particular one is for a generalized tilt-shift zoom lens with image stabilization. Well, that's rather a lot. Normal, just a quick overview, tilt-shift lenses. I have to, the obligatory plug, I have written an entire book on how to use tilt-shift lenses that covers all of this in a lot more detail and actually far less maths in the whole book than there is in just in this one patent. Some of the stuff in patents can be a bit tricky to read through. There we go, there is a Canon TSC17. Now I use this with my Canon 5DS. I've had this, I used to use it with my Canon 1DS Mark III. I even use it with an adapter on a Fuji GFX 100S, where the image circle, i.e. the size of the image projected out the back of the lens onto the sensor, is big enough for medium format use. Now the lens does show a little bit, when you put it on a 100 megapixel sensor, it shows its age a little bit, but if you need the view that you get from it, it's what I do, architectural photography, industrial photography. I use this lens quite a lot. I use the 24 more often, and I recently talked about Fuji's new 30mm tilt-shift lens, i.e. equivalent to 24 in 35mm, that I will be looking at in due course. I'll have a review of that. But I have got on the Northlight site, as well as there's an entire channel devoted, entire playlist devoted to tilt-shift lenses, how to use them and that. And I will reference some of that with respect to this patent, because there are things in this patent I have covered in other videos. Now, the lens itself, that's quite a complex looking lens. Mind you, these lenses are. The immediate difference is your standard tilt-shift lens, tilt does like that. So the lens is physically tilting. Shift is done by a different mechanism. So the lens shifts on the lens mount, and that is tilt and shift. Now, for those of you from a large format background, used to using larger cameras like this 5x4 over here, I use the term quite deliberately in the book, I use tilt as the effect of bending the lens. I reference tilt and a direction, as opposed to swing or tilt, terms you may hear in that. Likewise, I use shift in a direction as a vector rather than shift left, right, rise and fall. Now, if you know those terms, you'll know that they're similar. It just makes it more consistent talking about, certainly in using these lenses on DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, it's easier to think of them as shift in a direction or tilt in a direction, just as a general thing as that. But you will hear other ways of mentioning that. So there's a lens and its physical movements. If you wanted to motorize this, well, you'd have to motorize the physical movement of the lens. And a simple way, if you ever want to just play around and find out what tilt is, get something like this as a magnifying glass, which as ever will focus an image of something. So it's focusing an image on my hand here of a light I've got over here, and I can see the octagonal shape of it. I doubt this will show, unfortunately, but try this if you want. Shift is moving the lens like that in this sort of lens. You can see the image on your hand is shifting up and down. That's how it works. Tilt is more complex. If I wanted to get the entire plane of this particular book focused on a camera sensor lined like that, I need to tilt the lens. Now, I'm not even going to attempt to set this one up because it's quite tricky with lenses like this, but you will see mention in this patent, and you'll see it elsewhere, mentions of the Scheinflug principle, which starts to get you into the maths of how tilt and shift works. Now, I maintain that you do not need to understand the maths to be able to effectively use tilt and shift, but certainly this lens here, immediately there is no tilt mechanism. How's it working? Well, the idea is that there are two elements in this particular diagram here. 11, that's the aperture ring, in the aperture setting in the middle. But you have lens elements, two lens elements. If you move those elements in the same direction, it's the equivalent of shift. If you move them in the opposite direction, it gives the equivalent of tilt. Now, this gets quite complex to work out, and it is nowhere near as easy to envisage as a simple sort of tilting the lens like I'm doing here with this one here, where I just turn the lens and change focus, or even with the real lens here. So it's a more complex, it's not intuitive. Certainly there's no way of manually adjusting that to get it. This is where, in this patent, the movement of those lenses, and it can be on any axis, is an important feature. It's not just up, down, it could be any direction, any movement. The combination of movements of two elements there are controlled the same way as an image stabilization unit. So the lens is physically moved. Now, these lenses are moved in whatever direction the computer inside the lens, in combination with the computer inside the camera, they are used to that to get the tilt or the shift effect. Why would you want to use it? Well, the normal way or reason you want to use shift is for correcting verticals. Shift is the most obvious one to use. You know, it's tilt the camera upwards, buildings look like they're falling over backwards. They love those. That's the standard use of shift. I use it in landscape as well to lower the horizon, but still keep trees in a vertical, in a wide angle. Now, tilt is more difficult to use. It's not necessarily more difficult, but I find it's much more difficult for people to grasp the concepts of it. Now, I've come across, over the years of teaching people about this stuff, I've come lots of different ways of covering how tilt is done. There is no intuitive way of setting these lenses, these internal lenses. This is entirely an automated system. And it's worth noting that in the text of the patent, it even mentions having tilt and shift available for handheld use. Now, this is heresy to some. Now, I quite regularly use shift and tilt occasionally, but shift with these lenses handheld, if I've got image stabilization such as I have in the camera, the Fuji GFX 100S, 5DS, just make sure the shutter speed's okay. But there's nothing wrong in doing that. But the traditional thing is to say that if you're going to use tilt and shift, you absolutely need to use a tripod. Well, you don't, but it certainly helps, certainly for accurately setting up tilt. If I'm using tilt with a longer focal length lens and I'm using it, for example, for product photography, then it's quite a process to set the tilt. It's not difficult. There is no involved maths needed for it. There are ways of doing it. But what effectively you've got is you've got to have some way of setting the contact of the lens here. Now, this is another important bit of the patent. How do you make this usable for people? I've found over the years people pick up shift quite easily, tilt much less so. It can take 2 or 3 different ways of explaining tilt before somebody goes, I see what you mean. But I've got lots of articles, videos all about this, and a book. Yes, I mentioned the book. But yeah, so there is our patent. Now, key bit in it that I noticed as an example, and this shows an example of a screen. And it's showing objects on a table. Now, if you've seen some of my videos about setting tilt and using things, you will know that I have combinations of objects on tables. I've got lots of things that include little plastic cars like this, dice, other things like that to show the effect, actually show how it works. And in this example here, let's say I want to take a photograph just of the flat plane of this book here, and it's a larger and there are objects on it. all I need to do is touch the screen in 3 points. Why 3 points? 3 points defines a plane in space. So remember that tilt is not just tilting the lens up and down like that, which will lower the focal plane, your plane of focus along like that, but also the lens can rotate. The axis of tilt can be adjusted. Now, if you're using large format cameras like this, you have to sort of be able to work out how much vertical tilt there is and how much horizontal swing there is, and the combination of the two. With a lens like this, you just rotate the lens the amount you want. Why would you do that? Well, let's say I'm taking a picture of a plane like that. That's dead easy to set. But what about if I've got it angled like that? How do I match the plane of focus to an arbitrary plane like that? If you look through the patent here, you'll see there's some maths in it and some various other aspects of it, links to other patents as to how to work out this, how to actually do the calculations for amount of tilt and shift. But there is an easier way of doing it, and that is just to take a photograph, to use a sheet of card or something with lots of fine detail on it. Take a photograph of it with no tilt, and you will find where the plane of focus runs. Because remember, normal lens plane of focus is vertical in front of the camera's level. It's just a plane. So that plane will cut through that plane along a line. Now you look at that line and use that line to change the focus. Now, much simpler than it sounds there. So if you are curious about this stuff, I've got loads of videos about it looking at different things. What's key about this Canon patent? Well, it's interesting in that the movements are not this sort of movement. They are smaller movements. They are controlled by the camera, which means you could have preset settings. You've got motors moving things. Well, yeah, that's okay. I quite like the manual adjustments of this. It's really quite simple, quite robust, quite easy to do. Now, I've heard people say that these lenses are fragile, etc., etc. All I can say is take better care of your lenses. I've had this since 2007, used it many thousands of times, and apart from one slight mark on the front element, it is absolutely fine. I've had that since 2007. That's why the lens cap goes back on it, because that front element that sticks out like that really is just asking to be knocked or something. But that lens is really easy to use. The key for this sort of stuff is how are Canon going to make it useful? Now, is it useful to be able to just go, oh yes, I'll have my preset tilt shift setting done? Yeah, maybe, I can imagine that. But you tend to use tilt in complex situations where you're spending a while setting things up. There's really not that much effort to speed things up. Not if you know what you're doing. It's actually quite quick to set these things up. I admire Canon's attempt at including this. Now, I mentioned image stabilization. There are bits of this, if you read through it, you'll find there are bits, it'll say the such and such unit in the lens, brackets not shown. That means even more things inside the lens here. Now, this is a zoom lens, so there are elements here that for it, you've got focus. Now, this can have image stabilization in it. It's got tilt, it's got shift. I dread to think how much that would cost. That will not be a cheap lens. Mind you, these lenses aren't cheap anyway because of the optical quality of them. Perhaps by using this offset method, it means that not quite so much has to go into producing lenses like this. I am curious to see if we get anything. It's just a patent after all. That sort of bit. So have a look at the links in the notes for this, and I'll put it in and you can see what you make of it. And so I'll put some links to videos and some articles and stuff as well. Quite a lot of what's in the book here is based on articles which are on the Northlight Images website, which I've been written. So I've got reviews of all these lenses and stuff like that. But anyway, there you go. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask, because it is people's questions about these videos and things that gives me ideas for other videos and adding new content. So there you go. Please do subscribe to the channel if you found it of interest, and thanks for watching.